We pick up in Luke 24 after the disciples had gone to Emmaus, discovered Jesus and the risen and the breaking of the bread, and have now returned to Jerusalem to discover that the people in Jerusalem had also experienced him at the same time, suggesting that Jesus had broken out of the prison of time and now could move freely between them so that he could have the appearance of being in two places at once. But Luke isn't done dealing with the question of the nature of a risen body, because today we're looking at a scene that makes clear that Jesus has flesh and is not a pneuma, not a spirit. So that's one of the issues we're looking at here, number 6. And also implicated in this, as we'll see, is the question of their faith and where they stand on that. And we'll see there's a curious parallel and contrast with John's gospel in this scene today. So as I've been saying throughout, we don't know about the relation between Luke and John, but there have been surprising parallels in the passion and resurrection stories that suggest there's some overlap, but we simply don't know exactly what that is. So as I've been noting since the beginning of this unit, the section we're entering into now, you can see on the right panel on the right side of the screen, 24:36 to 53, is parallel to the first part, 24:1 to 12, and it forms part of the large chiasm that makes up the whole chapter, the middle part in 13 to 35 being the Road to Emmaus story that we just completed, which is an A all the way through F chiasm and back out. So you can see the parallels here, the question of the body, not finding it in the empty tomb and not believing it's a body here. The use of terrified, only those two places in Luke. The question of remembering what he told you either while he was still in Galilee, or the words that I spoke to you, or that I was still with you. And then the act of either remembering or opening their mind to understand. And at the same time, the question of disbelief, not in the same order, and the question of wondering or amazement, as we'll see when we look at the translation. So quite a number of parallels there that suggest that we should be reading this section in light of the first section there, in light of the empty tomb. And as I've been showing, there are also a number of key and rare words, and I'll leave this up here. The colored words are the key words throughout the section, and rise is certainly one of those. But predominating in this section is the use of rare words. As you can see, words that are just here or only one other time. And there's a few others that are either only here in Luke but known elsewhere, and I'll show those out as well. So quite a number of things. But in addition to that, there are these interesting parallels with John's Gospel. And the ones that are in the same color are identical parallels, and the ones that are in contrasting parallels are contrasted. So you see the red part is almost virtually identical. Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then there's the question of his hands and feet, but for very different reasons. And notice that in John, the response to the peace be with you is they rejoiced. But here the response is startled and terrified, and he questions them on that. So the showing of them the hands and the feet in Luke, as we'll see, is to prove to them that he's actually a physical body and not a spirit. Whereas in John's Gospel, the hands and feet are about Thomas, who's doubted that there's a resurrection at all. And then, interestingly, there's also a connection about fish. And in Luke, as we'll see, the eating the fish is to highlight that he can eat, that he's a body. But in John, he gives the bread and gave it to them. We don't hear about the fish because the fish is part of the story in relation to John 6, and I won't get into all that now, although he does give them the fish as well. He took the bread and gave it and did the same with the fish here. So here he gives it to them, and it's a symbol there of going out and becoming apostles in the verb sense in John's Gospel, apostoline, to be sent. And here it's a question of proving that he's got a body. So it's interesting how each of the gospel writers can use similar images for very different purposes. And it's just one of the many examples of why it's so important to read in context, both the narrative context of where it is in the story and the cultural context of each of the authors, so we can see what they're about as they do that. Finally, before we start, we're seeing the continued parallels between what we see fulfilled in chapter 24 on the left side of the chart and what you see on the right side from the first couple of chapters. And so now we're down to this: they returned to Jerusalem just like they brought him to Jerusalem when he was a child. The peace be with you, and the guiding our feet in the way of peace from Zechariah there. The question of being terrified here, and Zechariah being terrified there, and the prediction you will have joy, and their experience of joy here. And we'll get to those others next time. And I'll put up the key words and rare words so we can see through that. But interesting thing I'm not putting up here, perhaps, is the meal scenes, because this is not a meal scene. I included the meal scenes in the Emmaus scene because they're at table. But here there's no table, and apparently only Jesus is eating. We don't hear about anybody else eating. So it's not exactly a meal. It's just a demonstration that he can eat. So with that in mind, let's jump right into our scene, starting here in verse 36. As Latham notes, warning against what I'm doing right here, and it's important, so I want to note that we have to stop somewhere and continue somewhere, warns against breaking the passage at verse 35, as most do, quote, given the participle while they were speaking, that locates the time of Jesus' third resurrection appearance. And that's absolutely true, that this is all continuous and even simultaneous, as we saw in the previous scene that Jesus had been in Emmaus at the same time he was in Jerusalem. And so it's certainly showing continuous action, but I'd also highlight that we've saw the parallels in the immediate first section in verses 1 to 12 and this section 36 to 53. So there certainly is a break there in terms of the structure, if not in terms of the narrative. So important to highlight both. So while they're still talking, suddenly Jesus appears. And notice it doesn't say from behind locked doors like we hear in John 20. So I didn't put that as a parallel, as we can see here. I just started there. We see the doors locked for fear of the Judeans. And we don't have that parallel here. So I'll put this one back up. So Jesus himself stood, and Jesus is not in the Greek here. I want to highlight the only time Jesus is mentioned in the chapter, as I've been noting, is when the disciples on the way to Emmaus, Cleopas mentions Jesus of Nazareth as the one who's the events that are about. So just he himself stood here in their midst. And there's no question about how he got in there, but there is a question about his embodiedness, and so we'll look at that in a second. And peace be with you. And curiously, peace be with you in the New Testament is only in those Johannine parallels and 3 times in chapter 20 there. So it's really interesting that Luke uses that and for whatever the relationship is with John. But in contrast with John, we hear they're startled and terrified. And his green notes below demonstrates the unreconstructed nature of their worldviews, as will be expressed in the fact that they have joy, but they're still disbelieving. Ched Myers adds, importantly here, the disciples were caught between 2 types of fear: the terror produced by the state, particularly in times of war, and the awe that comes in the presence of divine power. Smith below sees this as engaging 1 Corinthians 15 to 35 and 50 in opposition around Paul's question of whether flesh and blood can inherit the kingdom, but I'm not going to engage in that kind of comparison here as I did with the resurrection stories, because I suggest it outside the scope of interpreting Luke. But perhaps when we get to Acts of the Apostles and we get to Paul's views, we'll come back to that. So startled here, as you can see on the right side of the screen, is a rare word, only here and one other time in the New Testament. They are connected to the inevitability of Jesus' death, and perhaps they're still in that state and terrified because they think they're seeing not a ghost, but a spirit. As Smith argues at great length, and very clearly, that pneuma was not associated with ghosts in Greek, which was expressed through words such as phasma, phantasma, eidolon, and all these others, but everything except pneuma. So ghost is just simply flat wrong. They think they're seeing a spirit, which is to say not necessarily a body that was the remnant of somebody who was dead and is now alive, but something else. In other words, they don't necessarily know that what they're seeing is Jesus, even though, as we've been told, this is not the first time they're seeing him. They had seen him before, but it wasn't narrated, and they told the ones who came back from Emmaus that Simon had seen him, but we didn't see that. And so this is at least the 4th appearance, the one from in Emmaus, where they walked along with him, and the one in Jerusalem, and the one that Simon had, where nobody previously thought that. So are we supposed to expect that what we're seeing is different here, or they're just noticing more closely? It's hard to infer anything from the silence, but here we find it here, that they're not sure. And it's very interesting that the disciples on the road to Emmaus had no sense of that. Perhaps it's just in the moment that he's arriving, in a sense, from the other dimensional space that he appears here, that he's sort of just appearing, and that's when they think that. There's not enough data for us to answer that. But he responds by asking them the double question, why are you frightened? Notice he doesn't say, do not be afraid. As you can see in my note down below, we see a number of times, especially in the opening chapters, as we see there. So he doesn't say, do not be afraid. He doesn't say it afterward. He simply asks the questions, why are you frightened? Using tarasso here, literally for stirred up or distressed, as we see in 1 1:12 in the beginning of Luke? And why do doubts, or on doubts might not be the best word here, inner thoughts, dialogismoi, which is a word almost always used negatively in Luke. But here, they're rising up, and certainly there's meant to be an ironic little joke there, that instead of them arising like Simon did to go to the tomb, or arising in excitement, that's the doubts that are arising, the wrong kind of uprising here. So they won't last forever, but they're there now. And so in response to their fear and doubts, rather than simply saying, do not be afraid, he offers a touch. And as my note below has, for Greek audiences, assuring that he is not a free soul separate from a body. And I'm believing that Luke has to appeal to those people because, as I've been suggesting, although he sees nothing about replacing Judaism with Christianity, he certainly sees expanding the sense of who Israel is from the traditional people to the wider scope, in light of his understanding of Genesis, that it was God's intention all along for all of humanity to be gathered under the reign of God. So he has to appeal to some sense of that, and that's why in the introductory video I went over some of the traditional understandings in the Greek philosophical world of what happens when you die. So if you're concerned about that, you can go back and look at that. So he says, look at my hands and feet. Notice the hands and feet. Why hands and feet in particular? If the issue is that he's embodied, it could be anywhere. But he offers hands and feet. And hands, kairos, is 26 times in Luke. And my feet. Is that perhaps because those are the places of crucifixion? In John's Gospel, we see certainly that point because Thomas had protested, I will never believe unless I can put my hands in the wounds. Here, there's no sense of the wounds, but certainly the hands and feet suggest that, even though that isn't what came up. We saw podos for feet at the beginning to lead us our feet into the way of peace, and also in chapter 4 where the devil tempted him to not hurt his foot, the quoting scripture. See, and the verbs for see are 3 times in the verse here, twice in the Greek eidon, and the third is theorio. So emphasis on seeing, even though the invitation is to touch. So look, see, and see. And, I'm sorry, it's actually 4 times in English when we see look there and 3 times in the Greek. Sorry about that. It is I myself, and this is covering up ego eimi, which has been a couple of other times. It was Gabriel saying it's ego eimi, but let's look back at 21:8 and 22:70 so we can see how that plays out. Because in John's Gospel, the I am is certainly echoing Exodus 3 and Yahweh's response to Moses, I am, which is Yahweh in Hebrew. So others will come and say, I am, and that's in the question of the revolution in the time of the Jewish-Roman War. And then in 22:70 here, in response to their question, are you the Son of God? And he says, you say I am. So Jesus is only saying it here affirmatively this time, ego eimi. Touch me and see. Only here in the Gospels for touch me. I didn't put it as a key word because it's elsewhere in the New Testament, but only here in the Gospels for touch, not the everyday word for touch. Touch me and see, the combination of senses will confirm Jesus' idea as their hope. For a spirit does not have flesh and bones. And curiously, as you can see on the right side of the screen, this is the only time in the New Testament the phrase flesh and bones is used. And perhaps echoing Genesis 2:23, bone, flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone, we already saw in their opening the eyes earlier in this chapter that it echoed Genesis 3:7, the opening the eyes negatively there. Obviously, opening their eyes there was the result of the serpent, and opening their eyes here is a result of Jesus. So healing that, if you will, much as we'll see the Tower of Babel story healed, quote unquote, in the story of Pentecost in Acts 2. So Luke certainly has Genesis in mind, and whether this is meant to recall the basic structure of human beings, you can decide. So flesh and bones, as you see that I have. Of course, that's exactly what they can't see, because if they thought it was a spirit, they could still see the shape, but it's only by touching him. So a lot of little humor here, and perhaps that's setting up the fact that Acts of the Apostles is a book full of humor, and maybe some of that's leaking into the very end of Luke here. So when he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And again, we have to wonder exactly what's going on. Can't they see his hands anyway? Does he have to have a special act of showing them? And since people didn't wear covered shoes, but were wearing sandals, one of the questions we'll see at the Ascension is one of the scholar asks is, what happens to Jesus' sandals when he goes up to the sky? But we'll get there in a couple of videos. But for now, it says he showed them that as if somehow they were not otherwise visible, which certainly they were. So it's certainly suggesting drawing drawing their attention to his hands and feet, and yet they have no response to that. And so it seems like that's not good enough, and he has to go one more step, which he does here. As my note below has, the Greek word order places disbelief before joy and wonder. So while they were disbelieving and wondering in their joy, so reversing it here. The three motions fuse, as my note below has below, joy, disbelief, and wonder. Or, as I was noting, I note here, wonder is actually a relatively weak translation here of amazed. As we see it is in all its other times, thaumazo, you can see amazed, amazed, amazed so many times throughout here. It's only wonder one other time in 121. And so, still amazed, they're still trying to make sense of what's happened. He said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" Again, using a word only here in the New Testament. Brosimon, there are plenty of everyday words for eat, and we've seen them because there have been 8 meal scenes. So we've seen plenty of eating, but again, Luke pulling out from his vocabulary all kinds of interesting, rare words here. And so they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and we have to wonder, why is that just sitting around? Certainly people would have salted fish that they would carry with them, but broiled fish, the word hoptu, which is basically for fire, for adding fire to the fish, suggests it was recently cooked, not salted, and maybe it's just left over from lunch, or it's hard to know. This is now late in the day, after all. They'd had dinner in Emmaus, so to speak. At least they'd had the bread, and then come back the 7 miles, and this is taking place late in the evening. So perhaps this is leftovers from their dinner. They just happen to have a piece lying around. Hoptu here in the Bible is only in Exodus 12 in the Passover story for roasted lamb, but that's certainly not exactly what's at issue here. He could have had lamb, but instead it's fish. And he took it and ate it. The only other taking and eating in Luke's gospel was a description of David and eating the bread from the showbread from the priest's place there to highlight the violation of the Sabbath was covered over by the need of hunger. But that's not the issue here. This is not about hunger. This is about showing he can eat. And he ate it before them, or literally before them. And we'll stop there because in the last scene here, we're going to continue with them, his opening up their minds now that they know that it's an embodied Jesus. Even though they're still afraid to say Jesus out loud, he will do the last step he can here to bring them all the way to be ready to be sent out in his name. And we'll see that next time. Bye-bye.